This video has been brought to you by NordVPN. Remember that guy who bullied Peter Parker and stole all of his girls? Well, it turns out he made a comic book, Cyberfrog Bloodhoney. Originally published by Hall of Heroes way back in 1994, Cyberfrog was the flagship character of comics industry veteran Ethan Van Sciver. Van Sciver would temporarily retire the character to start work under Marvel and DC, where he'd eventually create a whole roster of characters such as Dust, who could be argued was Marvel's real first Muslim character, and Jessica Cruz, who actually showed up in the movie DC League of Super Pets. And speaking of things the American comics industry desperately wants you to forget, Cyberfrog made its explosive return in 2018 with the launch of Cyberfrog Bloodhoney, a colossal crowdfunding success story grossing over $1 million in funding, making it one of, if not the, most successful crowdfunded comic at the time, helping spearhead the very first batch of indie comics by the group that would eventually be called Comicsgate, which is a movement of disenfranchised fans who walked away from the politically hostile era of 2020 American comics, alongside a crew of disenfranchised creators brave enough and, perhaps more importantly, talented enough to succeed on their own, all ultimately helping to prove that the indie comic scene could potentially compete with and outshine the mainstream. Though its detractors tend to call it a movement of bigots, which in the era of 2020 America carries about as much weight as a feather floating in the breeze. Now, with the release of Bloodhoney's long-awaited sequel, Wrecked Planet, what better time to take a closer look at Cyberfrog Bloodhoney? To make things a little easier, I'm going to divide the book into 3 parts: Prologue, Status Quo, and Wrecked Planet. You'll see why later, especially when we go over the book's narrative flow. The prologue explains the origins of Cyberfrog and his brother Salamandroid. We're told their purpose, powers, and responsibilities. Their mother, Chelsea, which seems to be a biotech pod curiously coupled with an artificial intelligence, explains that Cyberfrog was created to protect the human race from a mysterious marauding enemy maliciously migrating its way across the galaxy, the Vespas, and that Salamandroid was created to protect Cyberfrog. This is where we're introduced to the major conflict Cyberfrog faces, placing his life on the line, protecting a humanity who could only ever see him as a monster. And this accursed, lonely existence continues until Cyberfrog meets someone who would become his closest friend, Heather Swain, and this leads us to what we'll call the status quo. Cyberfrog fights evil alongside his brother Salamandroid against a legion of supervillainy with very punny names, while Heather Swain keeps her boys fueled with plenty of fried chicken. Status quo begins with the President of the United States, in this case, Bill Clinton, giving his infamous 1998 speech about his extramarital relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Except in this timeline, President Clinton doesn't have time to complete his humiliating confession, because at the same time we see the oncoming swarm of the apocalyptic destruction Cyberfrog had been warned about on the very day of his creation, making its way towards Earth. Back at Cyberfrog HQ, which is actually just a shack with what I assume is a bootleg cable hookup, something Heather uses to intently tune into the president's speech. Salamandroid tells Cyberfrog that Bumblebee, a member of the Rogues Gallery, is up to no good again. Then we get a nice Chekhov's gun in the form of a tracker that Cyberfrog places on Heather so he can find her after he's finished dealing with Bumblebee. Meanwhile, the Vespas have commenced their invasion of Earth. Chelsea, who's also the main source of Cyberfrog's powers, reveals herself in order to save an escaping human. Chelsea might be able to give Cyberfrog power, but she herself isn't powerful. So by revealing herself, she also doomed herself. The Vespas attack. Chelsea is nearly destroyed, and the human dies anyway. Quote, "Blood is the nectar that becomes their honey." Cyberfrog and Salamandroid defeat Bumblebee, but it ultimately doesn't matter as the Vespa's invasion is in full swing. In fact, this seems to be an obvious theme running through the book, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Anyway, Cyberfrog was built to counter the invasion. Salamandroid was created to protect Cyberfrog so he could do his job. However, Chelsea had already fallen, and Salamandroid had already been overwhelmed. And without the source of his power, Cyberfrog lacked the means to effectively combat the oncoming swarm, and he was eventually defeated, falling deep into the nearby water. Fortunately, Cyberfrog had a backup system in the form of restorative fuel cells that quickly began the healing process. Unfortunately, Cyberfrog had been devastated, and the healing process lasted years. And when Cyberfrog re-emerged from the depths, the Earth was a very different place. And this is where we enter the wrecked planet portion of the book. We're given a quick introduction to the new world. Humanity has survived, but the survivors have been reduced to living in the woods. And then we're introduced to the rules. Rule 1, stay in the woods. Rule 2, stay in the smoke and keep the fires burning. Rule 3, never panic. Rule 4, always wear red. We're also introduced to a new character called Lily, who's being taught by a mysterious lady in the shadows, who's totally not Heather Swain. Lily then goes off to find a mysterious him. This is where the Chekhov's gun from before finally fires. Cyberfrog can track down this human settlement because Heather Swain is there, and the tracker Cyberfrog gave Heather was still active. Lily finds Cyberfrog wandering through the woods, and the book ends with the reveal of Heather Swain. Now, here's the big boy question. How does the story hold up? Let's begin with the comic's most important page, the very first one. And the first page is quite well done. It immediately pulls you in with the mystery of a rocket shooting off into space, sparking the question, what is the rocket fleeing, and where is it going? This gives the potential reader an incentive to turn the page, which is organically linked to the story's narrative, as opposed to a simple page turn to finish a sentence or something. This scene of a rocket fleeing a planet, combined with the cold, unfeeling backdrop of space, and ending the page with a final dialogue of, and this is the story of my failure, immediately paints the work with a sense of ominous foreboding, which becomes a major element of the book, since Bloodhoney is a story that ends the romantic idealism of Cyberfrog's status quo and moves to the world's destruction. The main flaw of the first page is the absolute overload of empty dialogue. The dialogue in its entirety goes as follows.
This is recorded for posterity. This is for whatever poor soul survives, suffers, and seeks answers as to why this happened. Why this didn't work. What could have been done differently. And this is for who is to blame. I am called Chelsin. I was your last hope. And this is the story of my failure.
The first line is fine, since it's not only letting us know that the following dialogue is an in-universe monologue, but the idea of this monologue becoming recorded for posterity insinuates that there's something important enough to be recorded. In other words, essential information. The second line, however, is technically supposed to tell us who this message is intended for, and the answer is whoever finds it. Very zen, but no essential information given. No character growth, nor any advancement of the plot. One could argue that the "this happened" portion is actually giving us essential information, since it's hinting to some larger mysterious event. However, the first line already told us this, making the second line empty and redundant. This is something I affectionately call fluff. Dialogue that usually reveals no new information, carries no character development, nor advances the plot in any significant way. Dialogue that's simply present to fill up space. Lines 3, 4, and 5 are similarly fluffy. Line 6 is good, since it gives us the name of the speaker. Line 7 is give or take. While it does give us some new information, the ominous tone in the final line informing us that this is the story of Chelsin's ultimate failure changes a line like "I was your last hope" closer to something supplemental rather than essential. So, cutting the fluff, we can get something like,
This is recorded for posterity. I am called Chelsin. I was your last hope. And this is the story of my failure.
But how is the rest of the book? Overall, the strongest portion is the status quo, i.e. the 1998 era, with the weakest portion being, of course, the prologue. The ending, the wrecked planet portion, might be short on story, but it gives us a good cliffhanger, keeping the reader yearning to find out what happens next. And it does something we don't usually get in a lot of mainstream work, where the status quo is God. Things change. Even if the villainous Vespas were defeated and driven away in a brave act of dangerous daring do, there's no going back to the way things were, short of a Deus Ex Machina. In fact, both the first page and the ending of the book clearly show off Van Sciver's considerable experience. The characters of Cyberfrog, Salamandroid, Heather, and even Chelsin feel like well-constructed characters with depth, feeling, and individual personalities. That is, when we actually get to see them interact. And most of the flaws in the narrative are easily outshined by the characters. Unfortunately, the entire work is held down by the prologue section of the book. While prologues can be beneficial, I tend to place them alongside time travel and chosen ones, under the category of things you really shouldn't do unless you're really sure. A prologue, being a section that normally covers important events occurring before the main story begins, can be tough to get right, especially since it's easy to construct one that becomes redundant once the main story gets going. Ideally, the prologue goes over information essential to the main plot, and since it's essential to the main plot, it'll likely be addressed in the main plot, but with more narrative relevance, meaning you'll actually care this time around. Worst case scenario, the prologue is told to us like a history lesson, rather than shown to us like a story, and ultimately feels separate rather than part of the main plot. And the Bloodhoney prologue sections echoes some of these flaws to the point where the prologue feels redundant at best and downright detrimental at worst. In fact, the book would have benefited greatly by axing the entire prologue, save for the first page. Here's what I mean.
Oh, looks like somebody forgot to invest in some threat protection. You know who could have helped out with that? NordVPN.
Nice try, but I've come prepared. You're not taking over this time, Hold on, you're not Literature Angel.
Of course not. I'm Benny the Virus.
Seriously?
And I'm here to show you how dangerous the internet can be without someone having your back like NordVPN.
Wait, I thought the whole NordVPN stuff was Literature Angel's thing.
The internet is big business these days, and big business attracts big flies. That means one wrong click and boom, your whole system is flooded with trackers, malicious viruses like me, and a whole horde of other creepers looking at your sensitive files.
Hey, get away from that. Also, did you just call yourself a creeper?
And that's where Nord comes in. It's more than just a VPN. With Nord, you still avoid bandwidth throttling, hide your location from hackers and Twitter psychos, but NordLock can safely encrypt your files. NordPass can help organize your passwords so you don't have to keep using that same one you've been using for everything. And most of all, with just one easy click, NordVPN offers threat protection, which scans your downloaded files for viruses and deletes infected files before they ever get a chance to do damage. What the heaven is going on here?
Literature Angel?
Uh-oh.
And who is this fellow?
I thought he was with you.
Never seen him before in my life.
Well, that's all for today, folks.
What the bloody hell was that? Anyway, go to nordvpn.com/literaturedevil to get a huge discount off a 2-year plan with 4 additional months for free. Try NordVPN risk-free thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. Not to mention a heavenly exclusive deal on their entire Nord security bundle, including NordPass and NordLocker. Okay, that's enough. Now get out of here. Oh, why should I? Because if you don't, we're likely to be shipped again. Oh, right. Works every time. Anyway. If you recall, the prologue sections covers the voyage of Chelsin coming to Earth, the origin of Cyberfrog and Salamandroid, Cyberfrog's miserable quest to save the human race, and Cyberfrog meeting Heather Swain. All vital information. So, where's the problem? First, let's go over the origin. We learn that Chelsin has a connection to Cyberfrog, and this connection allows Cyberfrog to adapt to any threat. To quote,
"As long as we are connected, I will adjust and enhance your cybernetic body to meet any threat."
However, we get the same exact information when Cyberfrog is busy fighting Rumblebee, and then the Vespas invade. Chell, this is it. Adapt me. Rapid evolve. Same information, except this time it's during the main story and, of course, narratively relevant. It's like you went from hearing about some guy winning the lottery to being the one winning the lottery. You would probably be more invested in one scenario over the other. After all, Chelsin specifically said she can adapt Cyberfrog to any situation. With a little extra dialogue or panel, we can have Cyberfrog call on Chelsin to rapid evolve him to fight Rumblebee. Then we can watch it fail when the Vespas arrive and remove Chelsin from play, giving its loss far more dramatic weight. Plus, seeing Cyberfrog at his full power and then having that great advantage taken away will raise the stakes and ramp up the tension. Another option would be to save it as a Chekhov's gun. Rapid evolution can remain a mysterious feature of the Cyberfrog power set that might be inaccessible now, but should be made accessible at least once in a future installment of the storyline. After all, even as written, it would be a shame to mention Cyberfrog having this ability to rapid evolve and then never actually show this ability apart from a test fire. The prologue also tells us what Vespas do. To quote Chelsin,
"Blood is the nectar that becomes their honey."
Okay, cool. Is this going to be be on the test? Even Cyberfrog looks disinterested. Now, cut to the main story and we again get the same exact information. Blood is the nectar that becomes their honey. Except this time, this information is being said over a deliciously graphic image of a woman leaking out freshly made honey through her eyes, nose, and mouth. What's that you say? I won the lottery? Now you have my attention. The danger and horror of the Vespas are clearly displayed, and we see that they mean to wipe out the entire human race. We even get a tangible goal, stopping the Vespas. All essential elements for the story to function. And what about the rest? Cyberfrog's origin, his brother Salamandroid, his friendship with Heather Swain. These elements too were explained in the prologue. While these facts are cool, they aren't actually relevant. See, the only reason why we keep going over the murder of Batman's parents is to show us Bruce's core wound, a pain that motivated him to become Batman, that causes him to reject truly living life and can cause him to make enemies of his friends. Of course, we need to know Cyberfrog's connection to Chelsyn, his connection to Salamandroid and Heather Swain, but all of this information is shown to us far more effectively in the main story. We'll get to why in a moment. Everything else can be saved for later, ideally when it's more dramatically relevant. For example, Cyberfrog could be trying to connect with Heather and Lily, who seem to share a mother and daughter relationship. This could lead to a flashback of Cyberfrog's creation and emphasize Chelsyn's role as his mother, forming a parallel between the characters. We get character development, and it allows Lily to understand Cyberfrog a little better. Besides, telling us Cyberfrog's origin after we've gotten a chance to invest in the character will raise the chances of the reader investing into the origin. There could be a whole flashback section as Heather Swain and Cyberfrog reconnect, going over the very first time they met. In short, almost the entire prologue can be cut. Its information is either unnecessary for the main storyline or could be conveyed far better within the main story. And the major events it covers could be moved to dramatically relevant flashbacks. You know, Godfather 2 style. Furthermore, when compared to the main story portions of the book, the writing for the prologue seems rushed, as if the author felt the section was necessary but didn't actually want to write it. I tend to call this Solo syndrome. What's the mysterious secret behind Han Solo's super cool name? Well, he was by himself one day and a random Imperial officer just gave him the name Solo. Fantastic. For example, why is Cyberfrog a frog? Because Chelsyn landed in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and instead of finding brave men to use in the creation of an Earthborn guardian, she found frogs and salamanders. And because there were frogs nearby, Cyberfrog was born, told to fight bad guys, and sent on his way. The event feels rather shallow and empty, like Cyberfrog is simply going through the motions of heroism. And Chelsyn chose a frog because the comic is called Cyberfrog. So, how could it have been different? One idea might be Chelsyn finds a bunch of frogs and all of them run away, except for one, a brave one. This would lead to Cyberfrog being canonically created from the DNA of a brave frog who didn't run away, giving him an inherent virtue. Cheesy, perhaps, but fairly fitting in the superhero or Ninja Turtles context. So, the best kind of cheesy. And had the scene been given more room to breathe, we could have gotten more of a back and forth between Chelsyn and Cyberfrog, fleshing out both characters. A benefit, since we get a hit that Chelsyn's personality is more than the brooding figure we're introduced to. To quote, "Trick Run, I require your strict attention. Listen up, you. Okay, I'm listening." And again, had the scene gotten room to breathe, we could have given Cyberfrog a chance to ponder his existence, as one probably would, after being popped into being. We might even get a refusal of the call, maybe a bit of conflict. Maybe we could flesh out the character enough to get a character-centric motivation to defend humanity. As it stands, Cyberfrog seems to fight the bad guys simply because he's been told to do so, and he just goes along with it despite everyone hating him. In other words, he has no clear motivation, so he feels more like a robot lacking in autonomy. We need to see what Cyberfrog actually cares about and why he cares about it before we can really form an opinion about his character, and the prologue, unfortunately, doesn't make this clear. Then we get to Heather Swain, Cyberfrog's first friend, which actually solves the previous problem, though it doesn't answer what motivated Cyberfrog to fight crime all those years before meeting Heather Swain. Unfortunately, the scene is also kind of confusing. We get a scene of Heather being stalked by some possessed-looking guy, and then she needs the guy in the balls. Heather is successfully depicted as a no-nonsense tough girl, but the very next page is Cyberfrog rescuing Heather Swain, and we're told that Heather Swain couldn't win the battle on her own. own, right after we saw her take control of the situation. It feels like Cyberfrog just stole Heather's kill. In summary, it feels like we skipped a few pages, like the part where Heather was overpowered and facing certain doom, but it isn't there, so we never get to see and feel Heather's desperation, and therefore never get the catharsis of seeing Cyberfrog turn the tide by coming to her rescue. We also don't know exactly why he gets so attached to Heather, though I assume it's because she's the first person to see Cyberfrog as something other than a monster. However, we're not shown this scene. We're not shown Cyberfrog bringing Heather to safety and then immediately turning to leave, assuming Heather was going to scream or insult him like everyone else had, only for Heather to request that he wait. You ain't afraid of me? Why should I be? Because you know I'm a creepo monster. Aren't we all? It's just you're different on the outside, but on the inside, I'm pretty sure we're kind of the same. I kinda doubt that. Then the scene goes on, leading to Cyberfrog saying, "As long as I breathe, I'll look out for you. Promise." Bonus points if you had a prior discussion about Heather not believing in promises because, in her experience, people who make them break them far too often, followed by Cyberfrog declaring that he doesn't break promises. People break promises. I ain't exactly people. I guess you're not, are you? Something like that. Then, Heather believing Cyberfrog's promise, despite her better judgment, echoes the unbreakable trust Heather still maintains for Cyberfrog even years after the Vespa's invasion, insinuating that Cyberfrog never breaks a promise and never will, adding weight and connection that resonates throughout the book and beyond. But the prologue doesn't really give us development or robust character moments. It's more like a list of events, and unfortunately, it's canon now. Why does Cyberfrog exist? Because frogs were the closest thing to Chelsea when she landed. Why is Heather Swain Cyberfrog's friend? Because she's his friend in the main story, so they had to meet somehow. And also, Salamandroid shows up. Again, where did Han Solo get his name? Because he was by himself one day. Does it make sense? I suppose, technically. But not only is this anticlimactic, but these major moments in Cyberfrog's past, which should be drowning in drama and meaning, seem forced and empty. And these flaws are made all the more glaring when you compare the prologue portion to the remaining pages. When we dive into the main story, the energy is cranked up to 11. The tone, the flow, the character interaction all click very well. It's very clear that Van Sciver knows and loves these characters. They have unique personalities, and the personalities bounce off each other very well. And this is why I made the earlier assertion that the prologue is unnecessary. The prologue tells us about Cyberfrog's connection to Salamandroid, Chelsea, and Heather Swain, but the main story shows us every single connection through character, personality, and interaction. Something that often happens when the prologues often, not always, but often, tend to act as crutches for the author who has written archetypes rather than characters, so they attempt to solidify through monologue what they cannot solidify through personality. Van Sciver even shows an ability to sew in theme and commentary. For example, people have fired shots at the comic for including the humiliating confession of President Bill Clinton. However, not only is this an iconic moment of the 1990s, and therefore also acts as a major reference point for the era, but, narratively speaking, this is a commentary on priority and perspective, an element writers love talking about, with one of the most notable instances likely being James Joyce's The Dead, where everyone is talking about galoshes and silly little speeches. A woman is carrying the tragic memory of her departed childhood love. Bill Clinton's speech was a national phenomenon in the 90s, but it's quite literally overshadowed by the Vespa's invasion. Clinton is led away by the Secret Service in the middle of the speech. It's a little difficult to get angry at another politician being scum when you're facing the literal end of the world. So how would the story benefit if the prologue was cut? Replace the pages used for the prologue to extend the status quo section. The story could flesh out the world, show us what Cyberfrog normally does, how he handles things, and how his powers function. Show them fighting bad guys, show them partying, show more of their character, their problems, their goals and ambitions. Show them living everyday life, so it's all the more tragic when it's eventually taken away. Like the Shire at the start of Lord of the Rings. The way Van Sciver writes these characters, we can see that Cyberfrog and Heather Swain are friends by the way they act. We can see Heather is tough just by how the character carries herself and how she speaks. We can tell that she's tough without seeing her throw a single punch. And Cyberfrog and Salamandroid definitely act like brothers. Their relationship isn't overly saccharine, nor is it overly hostile. Had we been given more time with these characters, their happy little world and the memory of how they used to be would seem more tragic. As it stands, the story doesn't really start until we are around around 18 pages in. So, while it does leave readers wanting more, it's ultimately a combination of immersive characters, an intriguing developing story, and the fact that the narrative ends rather abruptly. We finally get a taste of the main story, and then it's over. Overall, Bloodhoney works as a rather effective introduction to the Wrecked Planet storyline that's, unfortunately, held down by the dead weight of its prologue. So what's the end result? Was the return of Cyberfrog snuffed out before it began? Did the newly reawakened franchise become the failure that so many in the mainstream comics industry prayed and bargained with the devil for it to be? Well, let's put it this way. Hollywood darling and John Wick / Matrix / Cyberpunk 2077 superstar Keanu Reeves launched his own crowdfunding comic called Berserker alongside, quote, New York Times bestselling co-writer Matt Kint, Folklords and Justice League of America, superstar artist Ron Garney, Wolverine, Captain America, Eisner and Harvey Award nominated colorist Bill Crabtree, BPRD, and letterer Clem Robbins, Hellboy, all under the publishing power of Boom Studios, amassing a staggering $1,447,212. How does all the star power anointed by the mainstream compare to the indie power of Cyberfrog? Well, Cyberfrog skyrocketed to success with $1,459,268, which means all the King's heavy-hitting elites were no match for the indie comic sphere of the 2020s. Cyberfrog Wrecked Planet outfunded the colossal, monstrous duo of Hollywood and award-winning writers anointed by the New York Times, showing that the hateful industry elite were only ever as powerful as the people they had long forgotten. You know, the customer. Like when Cecil, a Comicsgate favorite, yet also a member of the peasantry, i.e. never having been part of the industry, funded his own indie comic called Cash Grab, raising $284,292, outfunding the creator of Batman White Knight and DC Comics darling, Sean Gordon Murphy, when he raised $266,936 for his indie book, Plot Holes. Like when Eric July completely humiliated the entire American comics industry by landing over 40,000 orders and raising over $3 million on his book ISOM #1. And like when Leonidas drew the blood of Xerxes in 300, the sphere of indie creators who cater to the customer have proven again and again that all the mainstream flash and flare is simply mere illusion, and on the more even ground of indie publishing, the once godly mainstream creators suddenly feel chillingly mortal. However one might feel about Cyberfrog Bloodhoney, it's very clear that there's passion behind the world and the characters. And more importantly, the characters are clearly well-rounded and well-developed. And when Ben Sciver begins writing the main story, it's heavy and engaging, leaving me ultimately intrigued for the arrival of Wrecked Planet.